Okay, so today I wanted to give you sort of a preview of the final project by talking about the type and the form, the genre and form that you're going to be writing in, which is to write a minuet in binary form. Now, binary form is a two-part form with an A and a B. Okay? That's why it's called binary. Two parts, A and B. Usually in a typical binary, both sections are repeated. So you'll get a repeat of A and a repeat of B. So in effect, what you normally hear is an A, B, B type of form. You know, when you hear it performed or when you play it, that's what you hear. It's the A first, and the A repeated, then the B, then the B repeated. But this is called binary because you've got one melodic idea or one set of melodic ideas, and then a different melodic idea. Now, also, because you're part of the Harmony 2 thing is to talk about or discuss modulation and work with modulation. So you'll be modulating in the course of this piece. And what typically happens is in the A section, you'll start out in one key and then modulate to the dominant. Or if it's in minor, you'll modulate to the relative major. That's in the A section. So if it's in major, you'll modulate to the dominant. If you want to do your minuet in minor, you'll modulate to the related major. Okay.
At what point does the modulation happen? Is that,
Well,
do we do the repeat in the modulation, or can we just do it at any time?
well, the modulation happens before the repeat sign, so the modulation is part of what's repeated. So
Okay.
that's why, like in major, you modulate to the dominant. The dominant is not so far away from the tonic that you couldn't just end on a dominant chord and then go back to tonic again. So let's say you modulate from C major to G major, and you end on a G major chord. Well, a G major chord just naturally leads you back to the C major at the beginning part. It's also possible to have like a first and second ending. So your first ending could have a kind of chord that would kick it back to the C. Like let's say you end on a G chord, and then you add the seventh. Yeah, so you end on a G triad, and then for your first ending, you include the seventh to take you back to C. Whereas in the other one, you just do, and then you go on in G major, like that for the second ending. So in the second ending, as you're moving into the B section, you're segueing back into, you're keeping in the dominant key. So yeah, that's the way it's usually structured. Now also, yeah, as far as where the modulation occurs, you're going to write, in the home key in the A section. Let's say we stay in C. You're going to write a significant portion of that in the key of C. The modulation is going to take place at the end. So I'm going to want you to write like an antecedent, remember your phrase structure, antecedent and consequent phrase in the key of C. Right. So remember our phrase structure? Antecedent answers the question, consequent, or antecedent gives the question, consequent answers the question. So something like, 4 measures antecedent phrase, 4 measures consequent phrase, good 8-measure period. And then somewhere after that, you're going to start your modulation. Now, you might do that by going back to the antecedent again, or you might do that by extending the consequent, whatever seems to work for you. That's where you get to be creative. Woo! Yeah. That's where, and you could end up modulating. You could do another 4 measures and another 4 measures, and the modulation might not take place until this last 4 measures. Or you might decide that really early on you want to start modulating in the middle of this 4 measures. Because it's going to be 16 and 16. Your A section is going to be 16 measures long, and your B section is going to be 16 for a total of 32 measures. Again, thereabouts. If you really, really, really just had to have a little 2-measure coda on the end, that's okay. You know what a coda is? Coda is like a concluding section. It's basically a way of kind of summing up, and it's supposed to be the really final sounding part of the piece. Coda. And on a 32 measure minuet, your coda is not going to be huge. So you could have maybe 2 or 4 measure coda, but that's about it. You're not going to write some whole other piece. On the tail end of that. But that would be the idea, is to write something where you've got an antecedent consequent phrase in the starting key. It doesn't have to be C major; it could be D major. And then somewhere in the next 8 measures, you're going to modulate. You could maybe use some sort of sequence to modulate. You could do, now I'm in the key of G.
Will we be going back in the second and third
Yes.
chord to an antecedent consequent
Well,
structure, or?
In your B section, I'm just going to want the antecedent consequent in the A section.
Right.
You can write that same kind of phrase structure in the B section, but very often what happens is once you get, so let's say,
What about, though, my question was really about measures 9 through 16.
oh, here.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, at that point you would be free to use whatever phrase structure you want, yeah. But with the caveat that in a typical classical minuet, you're talking about 2 and 4 measure phrases. You're not going to write a 5 measure phrase, probably not. But hey, if it works, if you can really convince me, I'm open to the idea. The problem is, you can have a 4 measure phrase with what we call a phrase extension. And so it's the same phrase, it's just you've added a measure onto it. So you could have something like that. But try and think in terms of 2s and 4s and 8s and those kind of normal numbers. And so this would be the A section. Let's do that. And then in the B section, so it's going to be that, it's going to modulate, it's going to repeat. And then in the B section, you're going to head back from, let's say we went to the dominant G, you're going to head back to C at some point. And usually that happens very early on in the B section. But you could take some time with it. You could, if you wanted to, like we were talking about these circle of fifths progressions, like progressing around the circle of fifths or something like that. You could maybe, start in G and go to D and A, and then you use A as, let's say, the parallel minor. You use the parallel minor of A and go to A minor, and that gets you back to C major, or something like that. There is some creativity involved, and there's some, you can be very clever about these kind of things, kind of relationships. Or using a secondary chord as a modulation chord or something like that. There's a lot of things you can do. And you could get away with like a whole chain of secondary dominants. You could do that in a matter of, like 4 measures. You could go through a significant part of the circle of fifths in 4 measures, doing something like half, quarter, half. Oh, by the way, minuet's in 3. I didn't mention, but minuet is in 3/4 time, right? 3/4. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1. In fact,